Can you hear me now? No? Tens of thousands of AT&T and Verizon customers across the nation yesterday were in for a rude surprise when they were unable to get any service through the network for hours yesterday in an event that the federal government is now investigating. The outages started popping up just before 3:30 a.m. Eastern, spiking at more than 73,000 just after 9 a.m. The outages were mostly concentrated in the Houston, Atlanta, Miami, and Chicago metro areas, but affected customers across the country.
But the question on many Americans' minds, what caused the mass outages? Was this a terror attack by the Russians, a mass solar flare, an overeager beaver chewing on a power line? None of those, in fact, just good old human error. AT&T blamed bad code as the culprit for the almost apocalyptic level of service outages, writing on their website, quote, "Based on our initial review, we believe that today's outage was caused by the application and execution of an incorrect process used as we were expanding our network, not a cyber attack. We are continuing our assessment of today's outage to ensure we keep delivering the service that our customers deserve." So 12 hours is a really long time for an outage, Amber. I think about all of the people reportedly calling 911 just to see if their calls went through. 74,000 people reported that, their service was out. I'm sure a lot of other people didn't report, but just went online, went on Twitter to see if they were the only ones and discovered this was an AT&T wide outage. A very scary thing, especially when we know cybersecurity is not something that our military has been investing in as much compared to other militaries.
Yeah, and this is not the first time that we've had cases where cyber attacks have taken place against key American industries. A couple of years ago, there were attacks on our shipping industry, on our trains, and so it's not out of the question to think that this could potentially happen to our mobile carriers, the way that most people communicate nowadays. I gotta say, this whole scenario is making the doomsday preppers seem more and more sane by the day. I feel that way increasingly recently. And I'm also thinking twice now about making fun of my husband for wanting us to have a landline phone. Maybe he's right. I mean, when you're in a situation where so much of your ability to communicate with other people is down, especially in an emergency situation, I imagine there were people who were actually trying to get through to 911 because they had legitimate reasons to call them outside of just their phones being down, and not being able to get through is obviously a serious problem. And even just in terms of daily communication, I mean, it's such a huge part of our lives now that to think a coding error could have destroyed that ability for so many Americans is incredibly concerning. And I think also raises questions about the monopoly, I guess you could say, that a few wireless carriers really have on the ability of Americans to communicate via phone, text, internet, what have you. When one of them goes down or one of them becomes the victim of a cyber attack, it makes it that much easier to disrupt service for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans. It becomes very quickly a national crisis.
I'm very curious if the result of this is going to be a bunch of people switching networks from AT&T to another service provider. I was just scrolling through what people were saying who are AT&T customers on X, the app formerly known as Twitter. And a lot of people were saying that they were on the phone with customer service. Of course, once they got service back, asking about what they would get in return. Can they have vouchers? One guy asked for a $1,000 voucher. And if he didn't get it, he said he was going to switch his service. And then the customer service agent, according to him, was giving him advice about how to switch providers. So I don't know what AT&T's response is. Certainly not $1,000 per customer that experienced this outage. But I think it does evoke a certain kind of fear. We had the Houthi rebels reportedly sharing a map on Telegram of the undersea cables at the bottom of the ocean that give us internet access. 17% of the world depends on these cables that pass through the Red Sea. And I think there's a lot of things that we realize when we get reporting like this, that the infrastructure we depend on for our largely online world and communication that spans, regions that it didn't just 50 years ago. It's very scary realizing how fragile that infrastructure really is.
Yeah, and if I may bring up an analogy, this kind of reminds me of the situation that we're in with our energy supply as well, right? Because we really rely on foreign countries for most of our natural gas and our oil at this point. We don't produce as much domestically as we did even just a few years ago. And unfortunately, when we rely on other countries for that energy, then we are susceptible to global events in a way that we might not be if we had more of an independent ability to produce energy. I mean, look at what happened with the Nord Stream pipeline, right? Or when there are wars in the Middle East, all of a sudden Americans are relying on a very volatile industry, very volatile countries in order to get their energy, and it ends up making costs extremely high for everyday Americans. And I think it's a similar situation with our communication ability, whether that's internet, phone service, what have you. It raises a lot of questions about the national security implications of offshoring a lot of our things that we rely on for our daily lives, and even also the national security concerns of allowing just a handful of people to control those industries.
I think that's huge, right? Just the fact that so many people were affected by one company going down speaks to the oligopoly we have in so many industries in the United States, from, the shortages around formula for babies to now the AT&T shortage. I think people are realizing that puts everyone living within our economic system at risk when we have the industry consolidated into a few major corporations. And the fact that we have a global economy should theoretically mean that any kind of attack on a country's economy, whether it's attacking shipping, the supply chain, or attacking our internet service, which is something that our economy depends on. A lot of people are working from home. A lot of business is done online these days. That does affect our economy. Theoretically, with a global economy, people's markets or different countries' markets are so intertwined that, harming one country will affect the people in another. And in the case of Russia, we're currently considering sanctions following the death of Navalny. And when we look back on the sanctions we placed on Russia when they initially invaded Ukraine, we had the ruble go down immediately. It was, 120 to the dollar before February 27th. Then it went down to 72 to the dollar. And then Putin said, hey, okay, there's sanctions on me. But my response is unfriendly countries now must pay for Russian gas in rubles, in our currency. And within a month, European countries were paying for Russian gas in rubles, and they still are to this day. So to some degree, when we're sanctioning Russia, we're making them stronger. So this idea that we're not all connected to some degree is not true, but there are certain things that, affect our economy that don't affect theirs. So if they were to take out our internet, fine. But if we were to sanction Russian gas, that's something we're all interconnected, and Europe greatly depends on Russian gas. They're a part of NATO. So it's getting very complicated. But I think, cybersecurity is a way for them to attack us kind of covertly, not directly. And it's probably difficult to prove that they've even done it in the first place.
Yeah, it's a good point about the Russian sanctions. I remember that Germany in particular was increasingly dependent on Russian oil because they had decided to start making their transition over to green energy. And they basically had to either delay plans or pay a lot more for their energy from Russia because of this issue with the Ukrainian war. So that's a good point, and one that definitely rings true. And we'll continue to follow what happened with this AT&T outage. A lot of conspiracy theories about it. Maybe we'll get to the bottom of it.